So hello to everybody who's just joined. Thank you for joining our B-City Canada webinar today. This is about Mission Monarch, a community science program for monarch conservation in Canada. So before we get into the content, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the land that I'm seated on. I'm joining today from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's currently home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and it's covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I know we're participating from all across Canada today, so I invite you to reflect on the land that you are seated on as well. And as people on this land, may we all dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership, collaboration, and reconciliation as we learn together and contemplate the possibilities ahead. So in our previous two webinars, we highlighted how municipalities can restore habitat for pollinators and how they can empower residents to do the same through pollinator-friendly bylaws. And today we're going to be shifting from habitat creation to discuss how communities can help scientists to track pollinator populations. Specifically in today's case, talking about tracking the monarch butterfly. So we're delighted to have Agathe Moreau of the Montréal Space for Life Insectarium with us today. We'll be speaking about Mission Monarch, which is a monarch-focused community science project led by the Insectarium. In this webinar, Agathe will discuss the conservation context of monarchs in Canada, provide a community science framework for action, and explain how to document the presence of monarchs and milkweed in order to help the scientific community save this endangered species. We also have Alessandro Dieni of the Mission Monarch team with us today, who will be present to answer any questions that you have at the end of the presentation. So Agathe holds a bachelor's in environmental studies from the University of Ottawa and a graduate degree in geomatics from the Université de Montréal. Her passions for the environment and pollinators led her to do a research on social stingless bees in collaboration with the National University of Costa Rica. She later did community work in urban agriculture and then worked in an institutional setting in the area of climate strategy development. Agathe now works at the Institut de Recherche en Biologie Végétale, IRBV, as coordinator of Mission Monarch educational activities, a community science program under the auspices of the Insectarium de Montréal. So that covers my introduction. I expect we'll have some time at the end for questions. So if you have any, please type them into the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can then. And with that said, I will turn it over to Agathe to kick us off.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Jordan, for the great introduction, and super grateful to be here with you all today. I appreciate you all taking the time on a sunny Wednesday afternoon to talk monarchs. And yeah, just wanted to start off by thanking B-City for giving us this opportunity to speak a bit to the work that we do at Mission Monarch. So I'm going to share my screen and then we will get started. So just bear with me for a second while I do this here. Oops. I clicked the wrong button. Sorry about that. Let me just come back. Okay, here, we'll do it again. So sorry. Share screen. It's never a real webinar without a little glitch. So here we go.
Exactly.
So full screen. All right, we are good to go. So yeah, just before we get started and talk about Mission Monarch and all things monarchs, I want to start by kind of setting the context as to the work that we do at Mission Monarch. So although our program solely focuses on running a community science program, we're part of a larger web of stakeholders that have at heart monarch conservation. So really the research that's being done around monarchs is impressive, and scientists from all around the world have dedicated their careers to understanding this insect. So today we're truly standing on the shoulders of giants. So just wanted to acknowledge that before we start. So I have a few different things here that I'd like for us to share in the next hour that we have together. So we have 3 different blocks. The webinar was thought in these 3 different sections. So the first section will be talking a little bit about monarch conservation in Canada, kind of the general context and basic monarch biology. Then we'll be talking about community science and how that framework can help us take action to protect monarch in Canada. And then the last part, I'll be going into kind of the nitty gritty and how you can participate and how to collect data for monarchs. So let's get started. I find this slide is a really great way to start to kind of contextualize where we can find monarchs and kind of start us off at a broader scale, and then we'll kind of zoom into the native range of monarchs. But monarchs can be found in many countries. So they can be found in Australia, in New Zealand, in the Pacific Islands, and the Iberian Peninsula. However, the native range of monarchs is they're native to North America. And the hypothesis as to why they were brought into other territories is mainly due to human intervention. The question still remains open, but that's the hypothesis that was brought forward. So if we zoom in now a little bit more closely to where we can find monarchs in North America, and zoom into the native range of monarch butterflies, well, you'll often hear, if you read literature about monarchs, or if you read anything monarch related in North America, you'll often hear them speak about 2 different populations of monarchs. So the Western population that's circled in blue, and the Eastern population that's circled in red here. So these 2 populations are separated by the Rocky Mountains. It's important to note that they're not genetically different. So even though there's a physical barrier between these 2 populations, there is some intermixing that happens between the Eastern and Western population. We separate them and we talk about them as being the Western and Eastern population because they have different migratory paths, and they overwinter also in different areas, which we'll talk about in just a bit. So yeah, just so you have that in mind, 2 different populations, Western and Eastern. They're not genetically different, but they do migrate. They have a different migration route and different overwintering areas. So now zooming into the monarch itself. So the monarch is really an interesting and fascinating insect that goes through a complete metamorphosis. For those that aren't familiar with what that means, is that it will go through life stages that are morphologically distinct. So between the egg, the caterpillar, the chrysalis, and the adult, as you can see, is quite distinct. And it takes about a month to a month and a half for the full cycle to take place. So for the to cycle from the egg all the way into the adult butterfly, it'll take a month to a month and a half. It will vary depending on resource availability and temperature, but generally that's about the time it takes. And in order for this monarch's life cycle to take place, there needs to be the presence of the monarch's host plant, which is milkweed. Now, your mind might be going to common milkweed, which is definitely a great host plant for monarchs, but it's important to note that it's the entire Asclepias genus that is interesting for the monarch butterfly. So the monarch butterfly can feed and lay its eggs on that entire Asclepias genus. So there's several hundreds of species within that genus. In North America, we have a little bit over 100 species of milkweed, and we'll present a few of them to you later on. One very interesting thing also about the monarch's life cycle here is that the caterpillar, the monarch caterpillar, is specialist, which means that it will only feed on milkweed, whereas the adult is a generalist. So it can feed on multiple nectar sources. And we'll get into kind of each steps of the monarch's life cycle further in the presentation, because it will make sense when we're talking about how to collect data to monitor monarchs. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but just so you have a good introduction of this species. So we talked about now its life cycle, and now if we kind of take a step back. Oh no, sorry, I have something to say about milkweed before we go on to the annual cycle. So milkweed, as I mentioned, is the monarch's host plant. And there's a lot of interesting things to say about milkweed. If you've came across this plant before, and if you've maybe looked at it from close, you'll see that it's a plant that secretes latex, so kind of a milky sap. That's where it takes its name from, milkweed. And within that sap, there is a substance called cardinalids, which is a kind of steroid. And that steroid serves as a defense mechanism for the plant. So it's the milkweed's defense mechanism against herbivores. And the monarch, throughout its coevolution with milkweed, has been able to, or is able to accumulate these toxin within its tissues. So making the monarch a toxic insect. So that is very interesting in terms of advantages for predation. So it does give a great advantage to the monarch, but it doesn't mean that the monarch does not suffer from predation. So there's still lots of species that have developed quite interesting techniques to eat monarchs. That can be birds, mice, several kinds of arthropods, spiders, stink bugs, etc. But still a very interesting protection that the monarch has, their ability to accumulate these toxin in its tissues. All right, now we're going to talk about the annual cycle. So I gave you a brief overview of the monarch itself, of its life cycle, and perhaps one of the most, I'd argue the most fascinating thing about monarchs is its migration, the migration of the eastern population all the way down to Mexico. That's fascinated people around the world and is still keeps fascinating scientists and researchers. There's so much questions to be answered. But the annual cycle for the eastern monarch population starts if we look at the overwintering period, so that starts in central Mexico and the mountainous forests, the overwintering period happens between November to March. So the monarchs will overwinter in that specific spot, and then that will lead to the spring migration. So the spring migration will happen between April to June. So it's multiple generations of butterflies that will slowly make their way back into Eastern Canada. Once they get into Eastern Canada in June and August, that leads into the summer breeding period for the monarch butterfly. So once they hit our latitudes, they will start to breed, reproduce, and then around mid to late August, that's when the fall migration will happen. So these individuals will live 8 months and will make the trip all the way down to Mexico. So the 4,000 kilometer trip all the way down to Mexico at their overwintering area. So the round trip here from Quebec all the way, or from Mexico all the way into, sorry, not into Quebec, all the way into Eastern Canada is done in about 4 to 5 generations. So the important thing here is just to remember, if that fact is interesting to you, that fall migration happens in one single generation, and then the spring migration happens in several generations. Monarchs at their overwintering site. So I've talked a little bit about the fact that they overwinter in Mexico, in the central forests of, or mountainous forests, sorry, in central Mexico, between the states of Mexico and Michoacan. And I've put these images up just so you have an idea of what these overwintering sites look like. So it's absolutely beautiful and fantastic. I've never seen them myself in that overwintering site, but the images speak a lot about the beauty of that site. So trees are entirely covered in monarchs. They gather in large clusters for different reasons. It allows them to conserve their heat because it does get sometimes a little bit cold in that region. It also allows them to keep their humidity so they don't desiccate under the sun, and also gives them the advantage of protection, or some protection against predation. So as you can see in these images, these large monarch clusters at their overwintering sites allows for biologists in the region of Mexico to estimate the area of forest that they occupy. So that's an exercise that's done year after year. So folks in Mexico will estimate the number of hectares that are occupied by the eastern monarch populations. And that information is very useful because it can be compared from year to year, and we can see how the overwintering eastern population size has varied, and it gives us an overall population kind of status for the eastern monarchs. So it's crucial information, and as you'll see in the next slide here, this graph shows the number of hectares that are occupied by eastern monarchs at their overwintering sites in Mexico. So if I were to draw a trend line here on the graph, we'd see that there's a marked decrease in the overwintering population size. In the past decades, the eastern population has decreased by 80%. And if we look at the numbers back in 1996, we were at about 700 million individuals, compared to 2020, where we're about at 84 million individuals. So just a little note on that, because on the graph you see on the screen, you'll just see the number of hectares. And normally 1 hectare is about 40 million individuals. So that's how the calculation is done. The rough calculation is done. And what's really exciting here is that we just got the numbers from last year's, or this year, I guess, overwintering period. They were just released yesterday. So you are seeing kind of the fresh news for overwintering sites in Mexico. We didn't have that last little bar in the graph here for the 2021-2022 period. And you'll see that there's a slight increase compared to last year's population size. So last year, the eastern monarch population occupied 2.1 hectares, whereas this year the total area that was occupied is 2.84, which is a 35% increase compared to last year. So it's a slight increase. Although I want to say that it still puts the migration phenomenon at risk. So what has been established what has been shown by researchers is that to reduce the risk of quasi-extinction of the species, we should hit the number of 6 hectares at the overwintering sites. And as you can see, in the past 10 years, we've mostly been below this threshold. So ideally, we want to hit the 6 hectare mark in order to reduce that risk. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the causes of decline. But before going into the causes of decline, I just want to go back here for a second here to this map. And just say a little word about the Western monarchs. So I realized that I talked about the Eastern monarch population, which will be the main focus of the presentation. But just so you have it in mind, the Western population of monarch also migrates, but migrates a shorter distance. So it will migrate about 1,000 kilometers to the coast of California. So just so you have it in mind that there's these two different migrations going on. But for the purpose of the presentation, we'll stick to mostly Eastern population. So sorry, I'll just zoom by here. All right, so we know that the monarch population is declining. Now, what are different causes? What are the causes of decline, or what are some of the explanations of this decline? In reality, there are a lot of different causes that come into play and that can fragilize the monarch population. But there's three kind of main factors or factors that weigh most. The first one is the loss of habitat in North America. So the intensification of our modern agricultural practices, the use of different herbicide and pesticides have altered the monarch's breeding habitats. So it has caused not only the decline of milkweed in these agricultural landscapes, but also has caused loss of other nectaring plants that are essential for monarch butterflies. So what we have is a less diversified breeding habitat and also loss of nectaring habitat because of these agricultural practices that are have been intensified and even more so intensified with the use of different herbicides and pesticides. There's also the loss of habitat in Mexico. So as you've seen in the previous slide, the Eastern population migrates in a specific region in the mountainous forests of central Mexico. And there is, although that area is protected, there still is some logging that happens there that diminishes the quality of the overwintering grounds of the monarch population. And since the overwintering grounds of the Eastern population are very scarce, the fact that we fragilize that overwintering habitats will diminish the quality even more. So logging and removing trees will diminish the tree canopy, which acts as an essential protection for rain, heavy rainfalls for monarchs, amongst other things. But that's one of the impacts that it has. So it fragilizes the habitat. And the last cause of decline, which is kind of the usual suspect, climate change. And the fact that there is higher frequency of extreme weather events. So the monarch is a tropical species. That's why at our latitudes, it needs to migrate to find regions where it can continue its life. So climate change and cold temperatures, frost events, heavy rain followed by cold weather, all weather events that can fragilize the monarch population. Okay, so we know that monarch populations are declining. We know that there are different causes for that decline. So you might be wondering, what's the insects protection status in Canada? So in Canada in 1996, the COSEWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, a bit of a mouthful, but did it. So the COSEWIC recommended listing the monarch as a species of special concern in 1997. So I just want to take a short break here for a second to explain a little bit about the role of COSEWIC. So COSEWIC is an independent advisory panel to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Canada. So the COSEWIC will meet twice a year to assess the status of different different wildlife species at risk, and they can recommend a status change to Environment and Climate Change Canada, but they can't enforce its status change. So they emit the recommendation, and then it is up to Environment and Climate Change Canada to consider these recommendations. So in 2003, the species, so Monarch, was added to the SARA, which is the Species at Risk Act. A lot of acronyms here, sorry about that. And in 2016, the COSIWIC, so the Independent Advisory Panel, recommended changing the Monarch status to endangered. And now what's happening is that at a federal level, the Monarch status is still of special concern. So it's not changed to endangered, it is still a special concern. And we'll go into the next slides. We'll talk a little bit about what are the priorities Canada-wide in terms of monarch conservation and what actions has the government been taking in terms of conservation of the species. So in 2006, there were 3 protected areas that were added to the list of sister protected area, the sister protected area network, sorry, which is part of an agreement between the US and Mexico. As you can imagine, because of the migratory route of the Eastern monarch, it often requires collaboration with the United States and with Mexico for conservation action. So these 3 protected areas were put into place as this agreement of the sister protected area network. And so it's the Long Point National Wildlife Area, the Point Pili National Park, and the Prince Edward Point National Wildlife Area. So all located in Southern Ontario. And these 3 sites are major staging habitats for monarchs. So they're located at an important flyway corridor along the Great Lakes. So at these sites, monarchs gather by thousands, and it's an important part of their journey down to Mexico. So there's a kind of a bottleneck that happens there. So they gather they gather by thousands there. So it's great to be protecting these staging habitats, but it doesn't encompass the entire needs of monarchs in terms of habitat. So what are the other types of habitat that monarchs need require for their persistence? Well, there's, of course, overwintering habitat that we've talked a little bit about for the eastern population in Mexico. There's also breeding and nectaring habitats. And for the moment, in Canada, little is known in terms of monarch breeding hotspots. So we know that they come into our latitudes, that they breed, they reproduce, but we don't know yet where these hotspots are located. So it's been identified as a federal priority to collect data that would allow us to identify where these breeding hotspots may be and what kind of constitutes a breeding habitat of quality. And all of this, of course, in order to implement conservation actions. So all of this context to bring us back to Mission Monarch, which is a community science program that collects data to help us understand monarch breeding habitat. So you can see how it's in line and was created kind of in response to this federal priority to understand monarch breeding habitats. So what exactly is Mission Monarch? So it's a community science program that's run by the Montreal Insectarium. And it was started in 2016 with the support of the Canadian Wildlife Service, which is kind of the policy arm of Environment and Climate Change Canada. So they supported the development of the program and as the official monitoring program for Canada. And there are several other folks working on monitoring programs in the US doing amazing work. So I encourage you, if ever you're chiming in from the States, they do awesome work there as well. For those that aren't familiar with community science, I just want to take a minute to unpack what that means, what community science is, and what's its relevance in the scientific landscape. So community science, the definition of it is when volunteers take part in scientific work. So it's a really fantastic tool because it helps us fill knowledge gaps. It also gives an opportunity for the community to get involved in science and to democratize the process also. And it accelerates the data collection process quite a bit, as you can imagine. So instead of having a handful of people collecting data, there's thousands of volunteers across different types of landscapes and different regions that are taking part in collection efforts. So community science has become increasingly relevant in relevant and present in scientific research. As you can see in the little screenshot that I took from a publication of Follett and Strizov, that there is an increasing collaboration or an increasing contribution, of community science over the years. So that's very exciting, and it demonstrates the pertinence of using this approach for research. So how does all of this translate into Mission Monarch, and what's our contribution, or what are the kind of questions that we're interested in answering with Mission Monarch? So we're interested in, of course, knowing where or identifying where the monarch breeding hotspots are located, understanding what constitutes a good breeding habitat, and also understanding what the summer breeding population size looks like. So these are all information that we still need to gather and that we still need to wrap our heads around. But these are kind of the general questions that we're interested in answering with Mission Monarch. And in terms of data collection, we're still a young program. So as you can see here in the graph, Mission Monarch was launched in 2016. So there has been there's been an increasing number of observations and of observers over the last years, of course, with the two 2020 and 2021 being the atypical years for obvious reasons. But yeah, we can see that there's slowly, there's ramping up, and there's more and more people that are interested in the program and carrying out these efforts across Canada, which is super exciting for us to see. So getting into the nitty gritty. So we talked about monarch conservation and kind of its general context in Canada. We've talked about a little bit about basic monarch biology. We've talked about Mission Monarch being a community science program. And now you might be asking yourself, how do I take part, and how do I, as an individual or perhaps as a municipality or an organization, how do I embed Mission Monarch, and how do I participate in Mission Monarch? It's quite simple. So there's 4 steps essentially to collect data and participate in this community science program. And the data collection process was kept very simple. So anyone can participate, and it's essentially boils down to 4 steps. So the first step is finding milkweed. The second step is verifying the presence of monarchs, then writing down your observation on an observation sheet, and then sharing your observations on the Mission Monarch website. So the 2 first steps, I would say, are the ones that are a little bit trickier in the sense that participants need to be able to identify milkweed and identify monarchs. But once you have the kind of keys to do that, it's the rest is very, very easy. And I just want to mention here that the zeros are just as important and valuable information for us. So if you go out in the field and you sample a milkweed patch, but you don't find any monarchs, and you say, oh, I didn't find anything, I shouldn't report it. That is just as important for us to know that there is no monarchs in that patch. It's just as valuable to 0 for us. So if you do not find any monarchs, that's fine. Send the information anyways. For us, it's very valuable. So, oh, sorry, I'm just going to come back here for a second. So we'll spend just a few next minutes together looking at step 1 and 2. We won't go into too many details because our website has a lot of information and a lot of resources for you to help you identify milkweed and to help you verify or get familiar with the different life stages of monarchs. But I just want to give you a quick overview of these two first steps. Excuse me. So step 1, finding milkweed. As I mentioned earlier, there are just a little over 100 species of milkweed in North America. And the ones that I've put up on the screen are the ones that we share on our website. And depending on the region that you're in, you'll have different species that are more abundant than others, some that may or may not be there depending on where in Canada you're located. But our website has these gosh, I only have the word in French, fiche terrain, these forms or these little forms, I'm going to call them forms because I can't remember the word now, but these little forms that can help you, that give you pointers as to how to identify different types of milkweed. So all of that can be found on our website. But in general, so for the common milkweed that you see up on the screen right now, and I'll just kind of give you an example with that one. The common milkweed, which as its name says, is prevalent in a lot of different regions in Canada. The common milkweed has broad and thick leaves that are pubescent, so it means just a little bit hairy. They're arranged in opposite pairs. As you can see, you can see a little bit in the image of the leaves here that they're arranged in opposite pairs at a 90-degree angle. The flowers are shaped in umbels, so kind of umbrella-shaped flowers, and that's something that's characteristic of the entire Asclepias genus, is the umbel flowers. The colors will vary, depending on the species. Let me just go back here. So, for example, the butterfly milkweed you'll see is a bright orange. You'll have the whorl milkweed that's white, so it will vary in color. But the shape of it, the umbel shape of it, is characteristic. And the fruits are spindle-shaped and bumpy. And you can normally see them. I know I can speak at least for the Quebec region that you can start seeing these fruits anytime around end of July to August, and then they'll split open and release their seeds. And another way to identify milkweed is if you see the presence of milky sap. Although there are some exceptions, but that is one of the ways to identify milkweed. So step 2 of the protocol. So we've kind of quickly had an overview of the first step, which is finding milkweed. Now the second step is to verify for the presence of monarchs. So the Monarch egg is teeny tiny. It has the shape of a football. If you have a very good magnifying glass, you'll see that it's football shaped. It's cream colored, yellowish, and you'll see that it has longitudinal ridges on it, which is, you can see it kind of clearly in the left image. If you go out on the field, just be mindful that milkweed sap can look like monarch eggs. So just to be mindful of that. And now that you know the tricks, you can be able to tell them apart. But as you go out in the field, just to not mistake the milkweed, the milkweed bubbles for the eggs. The caterpillar, which is the second life stage of the monarch. So the caterpillars are, they have this characteristic color patterns on them. So yellow, yellow, black, and white. And they have filaments at the near their heads and at the tip of their abdomens. They will molt 4 times. So there's 5 different caterpillar stages. It's not important that you retain all this information. I'm just telling you so you know that it's a species that grows quite a bit. In 2 weeks, it starts about the size of a grain of rice and then becomes about the size of a pinky finger. So it grows quite a lot in 2 weeks. So you'll see the caterpillars, since they feed on milkweed, you'll see them, obviously you'll be able to observe them on milkweed, just like eggs. The chrysalis is very difficult to find in nature. It's kind of the expert camouflage. So it's turquoise green and has golden spots on them, and the casing will become transparent just before the emergence of the butterfly, which I'm sorry I didn't put up a picture of it. But yeah, so the casing will become transparent just before the emergence. It will be hard to find though in nature because it's, yeah, as you can see, it can camouflage quite well. And the last stage is the adult butterfly. So you'll see that it has these characteristic colors of orange, orange wings with black veins, white spotted edges. The male will have these 2 spots on its hind wings, and the female kind of larger veins, but that's hard to tell. So I'd say stick with the 2 dots on the hind wings. That's kind of the easier way to tell them apart. So we saw step 1, step 2 together. Step 3 and 4 are quite easy. It's just filling the observation form and then submitting your observations to Mission Monarch, which is absolutely essential. And that's what allows the scientific community to keep doing their work on monarch conservation, is when we submit the data and to our website. All right, so coming back to a little bit more practical things. So how can you as an organization, a municipality, a city, how can you take part in Mission Monarch? Well, including Monarch activities in your programming is a great way to embed Mission Monarch. So if you have summer programming activities, this can be a great addition to your offer. Also, we found that identifying people within your organization that can help promote the program is also a great way to create traction and to create to have more participants gather data for Monarchs. So if that's something that's possible, we found that throughout our collaborations, that's something that worked very well when people can talk about the program and can organize activities within their programming. And another way that you can take part is during this specific time of the year that we call the International Monarch Monitoring Blitz that happens each year. And I'll just go to the next slide so you have a nice visual to support that. So the International Monitoring Blitz happens this year between July 29th and August 7th. And it's a great way for folks to be part of a larger international initiative for monarch monitoring. So it's a period where folks from Canada, the States, and Mexico join their efforts to take a picture of, or take a snapshot of what milkweed and monarch presence looks like across the summer breeding range of the monarch. So that's an interesting opportunity also to offer perhaps in your organization or within your municipality. And now what can we offer you to help you embed Mission Monarch in your community? So our website has a lot of great resources. A lot of folks can do this process independently and download we have a little kit, a little field kit that has a lot of information on how to that will help you identify milkweed, help you identify monarchs, help you also identify species that might be confused with monarchs. So there's a lot of awesome documentation there. There's also us, my colleague Alessandro and I, that are always happy to answer your monarch-related questions and support you in your data collection process. And we also provide, you can also provide training to your staff. And just going to say a quick note that we also have resources for teachers. We have an educational kit that's available on our website. And we can also help provide training with that too. So lots to share. And of course, if you don't be shy to reach out if you have any questions. There's a lot of information on our website. And again, if there's interest for virtual trainings, it's something that we can certainly do. And I just want to give this last example, and that will kind of seal this presentation. But I want to give this last example of our collaboration with Nature New Brunswick and how collaborations kind of materialize into a larger amount of observations and larger kind of participation across Canada. So it's a really neat example of, you can see kind of in the table here what it looks like pre-collaboration with Nature New Brunswick and then post-collaboration. And we're only at our second year of collaborating with them. But you'll see that we've trained 6 of their employees and 14 of their community, or sorry, 16 of their community members. And they've conducted several missions. They went on the field to collect data for monarchs. And you can see that kind of, those numbers went up quite significantly. So in the past 4 years for New Brunswick, the New Brunswick region, we had about 31 observations shared. And 2 years in our collaboration with Nature New Brunswick, we have 241, which is quite a jump. And same with the number of participants, although that's an underestimation because Nature New Brunswick often will submit their observation using Nature New Brunswick, but that may mean that there was several other folks participating in that data collection process. So quite exciting to see what this can translate into. And just to leave you with this image here of the before and after. So on the left-hand side, you see pre-New Brunswick collaboration, what the observations look like in that province. So we had just a little over 20 observation points. And a few years into our collaboration, that has spread across New Brunswick, and we have over 200 observation points. So collaborations like these across Canada really help us enable or help us collect more data across diverse landscapes, across different provinces, and it really helps us increase our understanding of monarch breeding habitat. So yeah, really a fantastic collaboration with Nature NB. And I just want to leave you with 2 kind of other things here. So there's many different ways to take actions for monarchs. Of course, Mission Monarch is one of the ways. Also, habitat creation is a great way to concretely support monarchs. This does not fall within Mission Monarch's mandate, but there are several programs and resources that exist out there. I know BCity has a lot of great information on their website around pollinator habitat creation. And one thing to keep in mind when you create these habitats is to plant a diversity of milkweed, because studies have shown that by planting a diversity of milkweed, it increases the numbers of eggs laid by monarchs. So they like a diversity of milkweed, and also think about planting nectar producing plants that come into bloom at different times. And there's this great synergy that exists between habitat creation and Mission Monarchs. So once you create a habitat for monarchs, you can then follow, or you can then monitor this new habitat you created with Mission Monarch. So there's this great kind of match there between our program and initiatives of habitat creation. And the Space for Life has a Monarch Oasis certification that will give you different or suggest different species of plant that monarchs particularly enjoy and tips in terms of space design. Other ways to come and help for monarchs is through Monarch Advocacy. So advocate to have your milkweed removed from the list of noxious plant in your city or your province weed/landscape regulations. To include monarch at a policy level, so to advocate to have it in local climate and sustainability strategies. And of course, education and awareness is a great tool to create momentum around monarch conservation. So all of these actions help protect habitat, which can then become potential sites for monarch monitoring activities. And I want to close this presentation by saying that no one person can do it all, but the sum of us will create traction for monarch conservation in Canada. And we're starting our 6th year with Mission Monarch, and we hope that you will join us to take action and protect this endangered species. So feel free to reach out to us with questions, and we're happy to support you in your monarch monitoring efforts. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here, and we can go into questions if folks have any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Agathe, for that presentation. That was awesome. I've learned a lot about monarchs myself.
Yay, amazing.
Certified bee nerd. So it's very good to be learning about monarchs and all the other pollinators. And especially awesome to see that case study with New Brunswick and just the potential for getting municipalities on board and just to see how many observations you can get from those.
Definitely in special pandemic years. So I can imagine when things will slowly come back. Yeah.
Exactly. So we've got 7 minutes or so for questions, and I see there's a couple in the Q&A. So one from Kim, what is the impact of invasive species like dog strangling vine on the monarch life cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can start answering it and then I can let maybe Alessandro complete, but dog strangling vine has, or one of the impacts of it is thought as an ecological trap. So monarchs will lay their eggs on the dog strangling vine, but then not be able to complete their life cycle. So there is definitely, as we can observe now, a negative impact of that invasive species and causing that kind of ecological trap for monarchs. But yeah, maybe I'll let Alessandro add to that, and you can also see the other face of the program of Mission Monarch. Yeah, if you have anything else you wanted to add.
Yes, thank you, Agathe. I think you explained it really well. It's an evolutionary trap, so having that kind of invasive species can be an harm for monarch conservation. As of now, the program does not accept observation of eggs being laid on that particular species, but eventually with Mission Monarch, we'll try to have a more elaborate and extensive protocol. And that protocol will be able to receive such information. So we'll be able to understand a little bit more in depth what is the impact of dog strangling vine, for example, on monarch conservation and survival.
Great. And a question from Pat, I think kind of a clarifying question. She said, I heard you say there are many generations coming north, but only one generation going south.
Correct. Yeah, the migration is always kind of a tricky thing to explain. But yes, you're right that there are many generations coming north, and then one single generation. So the generation that we normally see at our latitudes around mid-August, that will make the trip all the way down to Mexico. So that generation that is born around mid-August lives 8 months. So it goes under what we call the reproductive diapause. So essentially it lives a bit longer to give them, to give that generation the chance to do the trip down to Mexico and then stay in the overwintering spot, lay their eggs, and then another generation starts coming back up north.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had no clue.
Yeah, it's so crazy to know that it's one single generation making the 4,000-kilometer trip all the way down to Mexico, and knowing that monarchs are, you know, a small insect, just below a gram in weight, and that they do 4,000 kilometers is quite impressive.
Yeah, amazing. Question from Victoria. Is there any collaborative agreements with Mexican groups to protect hectares for overwintering of monarchs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that the overwintering grounds are protected. They're part of a, I can't remember the exact name of it, but they're part of a protected ecological region. So that their overwintering spots in Mexico are protected. And in terms of collaborative agreement, I don't know if there's any specific ones that we can speak to, Alessandro. I know that there's, since the monarch, the eastern population goes through the States and through Mexico, there is, for example, collaboration with the CEC, which is the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. I know that there's a lot of things that are done in collaboration with them. The international monitoring Blitz is also done in collaboration with Mexico. But yeah, kind of coming back to your question, there is around the overwintering spot in Mexico, it is protected.
That's great. And another one from Victoria, do monarchs have any natural predators aside from man?
Yeah, they do have, that's a good question. They do have a lot of other natural predators aside from us. So there's different species of birds that can eat monarchs. There's a type of mice also in Mexico that can eat monarchs. Several types of arthropods that can that are predators to monarchs. So you can think of the stink bug, for example. There's also been studies of grasshoppers accidentally eating monarch eggs and smaller caterpillars. So more of an accidental, but there is definitely a lot of arthropod predation for monarchs.
And from Sandra, is there a problem between telling viceroys and monarchs apart?
Yes, good question. I wish I had a visual support, but let me try and explain it as visually as I can. But yes, they are hard to tell apart. They have kind of the same color patterns. The viceroy is smaller than the monarch. So if you think that you're seeing a smaller monarch, it might be a viceroy. But a great way to tell them apart is if you look at the viceroy's hind wings, you'll see that there is a vein that crosses the hind wings, which the monarch does not have. So there's kind of two, I'd give you kind of two tips to tell them apart is the black line on the hind wings and also the size of the viceroy, which is smaller than the monarch.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I see we're at 1:30. I have one more question from me.
Yeah.
I was wondering how monarchs know how to migrate to such a specific overwintering site. I don't know if we actually have an answer to that, but I'm very curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's still so much research being done around what are the specific mechanisms that help monarch orient themselves and come back to the same spot or around the same spot every single year. There are some environmental cues that monarchs will catch on to know that it's time to migrate. So the sun's, not orientation, that's not the correct word, but anyways, the sun's orientation in the sky will be one of the cues that tell them, okay, well, now we see that the pattern of the sun is changing. So that's a cue that we should start migrating. Also, they receive cues from their host plant. So the host plant that's slowly getting less and less nutritious as we get further in the season. That's another environmental cue that they'll get, that it's time to migrate south to Mexico. And then they have kind of different orientation mechanisms in their antennae, and with kind of the variation of the sun that help them orient their route back to Mexico. But still, it's a great question, and I mean, there's still lots to be explored around that. But yeah, essentially, environmental cues will help them know when to leave.
Yeah, that's also fascinating. It's nice to still have mysteries in science.
Oh yeah, that's definitely still lots to be researched and still lots to be learned.
Sweet. Well, I see we're a couple of minutes over now. And I think we've got to all the questions, which is great. So thank you so much, Agathe and Alessandro, for joining us today and taking the time to share about the wonderful program, Mission Monarch. I'm probably going to get out and start making some observations now.
Yeah, awesome.
And yeah, thanks to everyone that tuned in. Hopefully some people from municipalities that want to get some partnerships going between the two and get lots of observations in. And hopefully lots of people that now are excited about contributing to Mission Monarch. For anyone that is wondering, this webinar was recorded. So I'll make sure that we have it up on the B-City YouTube page in the near future, and I'll send out a link within the next week so that you can access that video. Yeah, and aside from that, that concludes the webinar. So I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of your day, and stay tuned for upcoming B-City Canada webinars. Thanks again so much. This was wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you to everyone.